The third house is the best house for Mars. And the reason why is very obvious if you know what Mars represents and what the third house represents. So let's start with the third house. What the third house represents is very obvious if you know what it is. What it literally is the area of sky that's below ground, but on the eastern side. So because it's below ground, it represents things that are inside of us. So like emotional, mental things. But since it's on the eastern side, it represents how those inner emotional things try to become physical, pertain to physical things, and try to be realized. So we could sum up what the third house represents with the phrase expressing the interior. And so we can divide its symbolism into the internal aspect of that expression and then the external effect of that expression. So for example, the third house represents the decision-making capacity, what you set your mind on going for. And hence it has to do with confidence as well as leadership and discipline. I've made this decision, therefore I'm on this path. So decision-making determines our ambitions. We decide that this is what we want. So decisions and ambitions are related. Third house has to do with our ambitions, our lusts, our passions, our hungers. And because we're talking about the eastern side of the underground, the east pertains to self. So we're talking about the ambitions and the decisions of what I want. And so the third house is a very self-focused house. And it lends itself well towards independent decisions, independent action, and individualism. Now, those are the internal motivators of our expressions. The external effects of the expressions are strength. The third house has to do with strength, muscle power, force, how much impact we exert. Thus, it also has to do with skill, not just brute force, but skill. How well do we achieve our ambitions? How clever are we in finding out how to get what we want? And all of this has a huge role to play in how well we compete. So the third house is the house of contests, competitions, struggles, you can say, conflicts. And the people that we compete with, our competitors, the people who are our age, our siblings, our rivals, our peers. Now, this place is great for Mars. Why? It'll be obvious as soon as you understand what Mars represents. So let's take a look at Mars. The best way to organize all of Mars' symbolism is to realize that the basic thing, the foundational, fundamental thing it represents is masculinity. And masculinity has two aspects, independence and inceptivity. So Mars is a planet of independence, individuality, freedom. Therefore, Mars is a planet of self-reliance. And therefore, it's a planet of muscle, strength, power, which makes you self-reliant, which lets you be independent. And that's also why it's the planet of weapons, tools, technologies, techniques, machines, and so forth, because those are the things that amplify and multiply our strengths and powers. And Mars is the planet of conflicts, the conflict of strength. Conflicts, contentions, competitions, struggles, wars, fighting, and also the people with whom we struggle with and contest with and compete with, our siblings, our peers, our rivals. Does it sound familiar? How about this thing about masculinity being inceptive? It is the initiator of things. It starts things. And it has an ambition that doesn't like to stand still. It's passionate. It gets things moving. It's lusty. It's hungry for things. It can't wait. Therefore, it's brave and bold. It's not preparatory. It's not prudent. It's bold and ready to go, courageous, confident. And it's decisive, commanding, and dominant. So you may have noticed that Mars and the third house are almost exactly the same in what they symbolize. So things are going to look very good when we do the next step that we always do for interpreting a planet in a house, which is compare the things that they symbolize and see how those things resonate with each other. So first of all, Mars is the planet of individuality, and the third house is the house of individuality. It's the house of self-focus. That is basically a synergy between the root of what Mars symbolizes and what the third house symbolizes. So it will cause everything on that branch of independence to be harmonious and synergistic with the symbolism of the third house. Self-reliance is very synergistic with the third house. Strength is obviously very synergistic with the third house. Conflict is also what the third house represents. Dealing with competitors. So everything in that one branch is going to go well for Mars when it's in the third house, ignoring all the other conditions like perhaps Mars has bad dignity or bad aspects, etc., etc. The other thing is that Mars was the planet of initiative, and the third house is the house of ambitions. And again, since this is the root of one of the branches of Mars's symbolism, it's going to cause that whole branch to go well with the things that the third house represents. Mars has to do with passion. Same thing with the third house, lust. Mars has to do with bravery and courage. Same thing that the third house. Mars has to do with command and decision and decisiveness. Same thing as the third house. So basically, everything on both branches of Mars' symbolic tree goes really well with what the third house symbolizes. And that is why all the classical astrologers clearly say that Mars in the third house tends to be fantastic. Now let's flesh out some of these things into particular specific words so we can understand how to interpret Mars in the third house. The synergy on the left branch of Mars' symbolism means that Mars in the third house indicates a person who is a very successful mold breaker. They break the mold. They don't have to be like other people. They can succeed and be different. In fact, their differentness from others is what makes them noteworthy, attractive, powerful. These people tend to be intelligent, especially with technology, techniques, and technicalities. And they also tend to be very ingenious in figuring out how to use tools and machinery, etc., to achieve goals and fulfill needs. So they're inventive and ingenious. People with Mars in the third house tend to be strong. You cannot dominate them. They are dominant, and they don't really need your cooperation because they're independent. Even when the odds are against them, or even when others are not cooperating with them, they still succeed. And on the other hand, the other side of Mars' symbolic tree about ambition, well, simply these people are very ambitious. It means they think big, and this is the thing that pushes them to break molds. They don't want to be stuck in the little box. They want to be more, they want to know more, they want to go further. They're bold, they're assertive, and they're brave. They're confident in their abilities, and therefore they tend to be decision makers who take the lead and achieve dominant positions. Now, this is the theoretical view of what Mars should look like in a vacuum in the third house. Let's take it out of the vacuum now and put it into some charts and see how it actually works. So here are 4 well-known people who have Mars in the third house. Leonardo DaVinci, whose birth time is known due to a diary left by his grandfather. Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher. Kamala Harris, and Richard Ramirez, the serial killer. So all of them are very interesting in light of Mars in the third house. Leonardo da Vinci, super genius inventor. Very atypical person. How is he atypical? Besides the obvious thing that he thought in very unusual ways, he's also sexually atypical. He's a homosexual. He was philosophically, religiously atypical. He was a vegetarian, for example. He was even a fashion atypical. He was very fashion conscious, but not in current trends. He would come up with his own styles. Immanuel Kant, another super genius. Not exactly a super genius inventor, but a super genius critic, which is also very good for Mars because Mars is very cutting or slicing, or assesses the practicality of things. And this was Immanuel Kant's shtick, the practicality of philosophical ideas. He's also very atypical in his sexuality. He's basically a asexual person, not withdrawn, just liking his independence and liking his individuality and not finding a need for partnership. Kamala Harris, a very good example of Mars in the third house, of somebody who's indomitable, achieves a dominant position even when the odds are against it. A mold breaker, a brave, ambitious, confident person. And Richard Ramirez, very dominant, very aggressive mold breaker in the sense of a lawbreaker. So let's take a look at his chart and find out why he's a serial killer, and compare it with, let's say, Leonardo da Vinci. At first, we might think, wow, these two Marses in the third houses look quite the same. They're both in Aquarius, which means both of these people have Sagittarius rising, which means these Marses have the same lordships and so forth. Now, actually, they're not in the same place in Aquarius. Da Vinci's is Vargotum, but that's not really where the big truth about the difference in their chart lies. The big thing that's very different about the two of their charts is what's happening in the fourth house. With Da Vinci, he has Gajukeshari Yoga in his fourth house, the conjunction of Jupiter in its own sign with the moon in a quadrant. So this is a very beautiful yoga that makes a person really intelligent and learned. Mars in the third house for Da Vinci exists in that context. But in Richard Ramirez's case, K2, Moon, Mercury in Pisces, days after solar eclipse. This screams insanity. This is an insane person. Mercury, the intellect, Moon, the mind, in Pisces, a very psychologically relevant sign. In the fourth house, a very emotionally relevant sign. With K2, tightly with K2, a very intensifying force right after a solar eclipse, right after K2 was at its greatest power. And on top of that, it's exactly at the aspect point of Saturn. So you're giving cruelty to this insanity. So Mars in the third house for Richard Ramirez is in the context of this cruel insanity, whereas Mars in the third house for Leonardo da Vinci is in the context of this great learning and scholarship and wisdom. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.